Hello, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now we're starting session 3 of the 7th topic of the semester, which is titled World Revolutions, Mexico, Russia, and China. Now in this session, we're going to continue looking at the Russian Revolution, something we started covering at the end of session 2. So we're here now in a time in Russia when there is the attempt by the Russian state to rapidly modernize the economy, particularly, again, transforming agriculture, into a more capitalist system geared towards the market and profits, and also industry. Again, Russia is trying to catch up with the West and trying to rapidly industrialize, and this is also going to set off a series of problems due to the fact that, once again, the working conditions for the Russian proletariat, as they were known, were quite horrible. They received meager wages, and we see a great many of them actually living in factory housing, for example, what in the United States will be called, for example, a company town as well, and those were massive industrial plants, and we see overcrowdedness. And again, this is not really what the workers anticipated when they moved to the industrial centers in search for wages and a better life. So this is going to lead to discontent, and at the same time a growing feeling of nationalism due to the fact that many of the industrial owners, the managers and supervisors, were foreigners, overseeing a Russian workforce, and the Russian workers feel very much exploited by them. And so again, this is going to lead to massive discontent, and this is going to be expressed as early as 1905, very, very early in that year. We're going to see a march, a workers' march, to the royal palace. As we'll see, this incident is going to turn into a kind of massacre that will be remembered in Russia as Bloody Sunday. Again, this is workers marching to the royal palace to appeal to the Tsar for help. In Russia, there has been a long-standing tradition of viewing the Tsar of Russia as a father figure, somebody who was there to protect the population and such. And again, this is really what the workers wanted, is just the Tsar to intervene in the affairs of the workers, to protect them, to provide better conditions and such. And, when the march reached the royal palace, although the Tsar was not there at the palace, the guards moved in with their cavalry and tried to disperse the crowd and use force, brutal force, opened fire against the crowd and ended up killing thousands of them. It is estimated that about 4,000 workers died in this march. This became known as Bloody Sunday. So this really created a rift, if you will, between the masses and the state. People do not see the Tsar anymore as the father figure that was there trying to protect them, but rather that the Tsar and his family, the royal dynasty, was totally disconnected, living in a bubble, so to speak, totally oblivious to the suffering of the people. And this is going to lead to a revolution, a massive reaction. In 1905, in that same year, workers and peasants, both of whom felt exploited and driven out of their own lands, and without the possibility of really, earning a living, a decent living in Russia, are going to stage a massive revolt across Russia. The Tsar is now really sensing the true discontent across Russian society, as the lower classes, so to speak, are now agitated and they want significant change to take place. And so, feeling cornered, the Tsar tries to resolve the situation by granting the Russian masses a national assembly, a quote unquote a political reform that will provide a representative form of government. Now, this is not really, again, democracy by any stretch of the imagination, but this is perhaps a step forward in that direction. This is a National Assembly, a kind of parliament, so to speak, or Congress, if you will, that in Russia was called the Dumas. Okay, is really a legislative body, quote unquote, in which representatives will be elected in order to pass legislation to address problems at the local, provincial level across the empire. However, it was far from democratic because still this National Assembly of Representatives was still very much in the hands of the liberal elites, particularly the nobility and the upper middle class. So again, the masses, the peasantry and the workers were not really there represented. So it really was a very, very limited democratic institution that provided also limited franchise. Only members of the nobility and the educated elites, for example, merchants with wealth and power and education, they could vote. So the Tsar, however, was still very much in charge of the state. Again, so he is creating a secondary arm or branch of government, but he's still the absolute ruler nonetheless. So again, it's still very an absolute monarchy. But this was done to, quote unquote, appease the masses, to kind of quell the revolution by a peaceful solution. But the situation remained pretty much unchanged. And this is going to lead to the immediate events, to the actual revolution itself that is going to topple the czarist regime. We're going to see now the spark of the revolution that created by the inefficiency, the incompetence of the czarist regime. In this case, we're talking about Tsar Nicholas II, who ruled Russia from 1894 to 1917. Now, his family was, as I said, totally disconnected from the suffering of the masses. His wife, Alexandria, for example, in many occasions was in charge of the state when Nicholas was absent. When Nicholas had to leave the capital, for example, and attend other matters, Alexandra, his wife, was the one in charge. And he really, Alexandra knew nothing of state matters. And it was also believed that she was in charge of the state in Nicholas's absence, alongside a monk by the name of Rasputin. And Rasputin was considered a sort of like a mad monk who was believed to have some form of healing powers that were used to heal the son of the Tsar, who suffered from hemophilia. Again, this is a very common disease among royals in Europe. So Rasputin will be summoned every time the boy was ill, and apparently Rasputin was the only one who could actually make him well. So both Alexandria and Rasputin were in charge of Russia from time to time. And once again, they really knew absolutely nothing of state matters, of how to run the empire, how to address the economy, or how to run a war. And this is another situation that is going to lead to the fall of the Tsarist regime in Russia, is the fact that in 1914 we see a new development in Europe, the beginning of the Great War, otherwise known as World War I. Now, Russia decides to join the war, despite the fact that Russia was in no position to do so. It had a very weak military. It had significant internal problems, particularly dealing with agriculture and food production. They were still dealing with a very inefficient agricultural system that had not yet modernized. And so they were really faced with food shortages from time to time that affected not only the peasantry in the countryside, but also the industrial workers in the city that were not properly fed. So to top it off, the Russian military also was quite disorganized and was not well equipped. They did not have, for example, the type of military technologies that Germany, in this case, the main contender against Russia, had. They were still relying on cavalry, for instance, the Russian army, whereas the Germans were using tanks, for example. So again, this was a total military fiasco for Russia, and you can see that by early 1917, Russia had suffered great losses. About 6 million soldiers were killed, and about 3 million were captured during battle, prisoners of war. So this was a total catastrophe, to say the least. And this is going to lead to massive, also, discontent within Russia that is going to involve the military as well. Okay, so it's not just the peasants and the workers, but also the military is going to be quite disgruntled at the fact that they were sent to be butchered in the front lines again by the Tsar. And in many cases, the Tsar will go to the battlefield and try to lead the troops himself, which he knew nothing about as well, while back home, Alexandria and Rasputin were also running the empire during wartime. So this was a total fiasco. So as a result of the accumulated problems within Russia, we're going to see now in 1917 the real boiling point of unrest, when workers go to the capital, Petrograd or St. Petersburg, and they try to seize control of the capital. So this is now a true revolution. They want to oust, in other words, the Tsar, and the military will come in, and at that point, they were given orders to disperse the crowd, but the military refused to shoot at the crowd this time. Okay, and the reason was because the military also felt quite disgruntled at the Tsar as well. They wanted peace. They wanted to stop the war. They were being slaughtered. And so they refused to disperse the crowd. And now the Tsar is forced to abdicate. They stepped down. So this left Russia with only the Duma, this national assembly that is now in charge of the empire. Okay, so we're not looking at a monarchy anymore, but rather a national assembly that assumes control of Russia. However, by this time, there are significant struggles for power within Russia, as there are now factions. Try to see this as a kind of like a vacuum of power left by the absence of the Tsar. And this is going to start now building tensions within Russia, as many groups are trying to fill in that vacuum and take charge, in other words, again, of the state. And we see a series of factions, particularly, for example, on one hand, the socialists want to create a type of state in which there will be elections, for example, like a democratic system. And they want a state that will pass legislation to address the problems of the masses, create social welfare programs, for example, housing, land reform, etc. Again, the socialists, they're really trying to address the social ills of the economy, produced by the economy, like, for example, the lack of land and poverty, etc. All of that. But at the same time, they want democracy. On the other hand, we see the aristocrats, the members of the nobility, the gentry, the upper middle class, the educated elites, that see the socialists as a threat to Russia. They're called the so-called radicals. In other words, they want to implement radical reforms that will affect the interest of the upper classes. So again, they kind of divide themselves into those two general factions initially. Here we see that the socialists are going to carry more weight, as one of their leaders, Kerensky, a socialist leader, assumes power in the Duma. And so he's now heading the Duma, but he's going to feel very much pressure from all sides, as there were people that were trying to pull him in one direction or another. He's trying to appease the socialists. He's also trying to keep the nobility and the gentry pacified as well. But none are content with his position of mediating for all groups. And we see in the midst of all this a new political group that is far more radical than the socialists, and those were the Soviets. Now, those were the actual workers who had formed what is called a council, a workers' council. So that's the meaning of Soviet. The meaning of the Soviet, again, the translation of that is a workers' council. And those workers' councils are communist, alongside the ideas of Marx that we talked about in session 1. And they are well armed. So this is a paramilitary group, and they're going to be known as the Red Guards. Again, so they are indeed the communists, in other words, and they really want a communist state. They want to carry out a communist revolution. They sense that the socialists do not go that far in the kind of state that they want to implement, that they're still quite mild, in other words, in the way that they want to implement change. And the communists are really pushing for more radical transformation, particularly using the state, in this case, in order to create a communist classless society. Abolish private property, for example, and have a proletariat in control of the state. Again, so they're far more radical in that regard. They are going to, the Soviets, be known as the Bolsheviks. This is a word that in Russia translate as the majority, for example. They are indeed the communists. They're led by leaders such as Vladimir Lenin, who in previous years had been exiled by the Tsar for actually, agitating in Russia and creating a communist movement. And during the war, the Great War or World War I, Vladimir Lenin was still in exile, and he's going to come into Russia now that the Tsar has abdicated. He's going to come into Russia, trying to organize the workers' councils and trying to seize control of the state, the Duma in this case, maybe abolish it and create a new form of government. And he's coming in with a propaganda message that will appeal to all sectors of society, he believed. And this message was based on what is called peace, land reform, and bread. Peace meaning that, look, this is going to end the war. We're going to strike for peace because millions of people are dying. As a result of this, land reform is to give the land back to the peasants because they have been driven out of their own lands, and also bread as well to feed the industrial workers and to feed the country at large that is starving. And this was a very, very, very popular message in a time of crisis. Again, so it was quite timing, if you will, the moment when Lenin is trying to advertise communism in Russia, due to the fact that Russia's society and the Russian economy was disintegrating, by the day. So, the problem at this time with the Duma trying to contain the communists was the fact that the socialists are in charge of the Duma, Kerensky is still in charge. They continue with the war. So this becomes quite unpopular, massively unpopular, because people really wanted to put an end to that. And the fact that, Kerensky keeps the Russia in the war really was perhaps one of the most important decisions that led to his own downfall and the rise of the Bolsheviks. And so in November of 1917, finally, the Red Guards, who have been organized by an individual, Trotsky in this case, who's really the main organizer of the Red Guards, they march into the capital and they seize power by force. So they seize control now of the state. Okay, and the Bolsheviks are now in power. Lenin is the leader of the Bolsheviks, and so he's going to assume control of Russia, and he's going to start building a new state, although there will be significant opposition for that. Again, there's going to be intense resistance on many fronts, as we'll see. One of the very first order of business for Lenin, in this case, was to sue for peace. The Bolsheviks sue for peace, and they're quite forced to sign a peace treaty that was very detrimental to Russian interest. They signed a peace treaty with the Germans, known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which the Germans demanded great portions of territory from Russia in return for peace. So this was a very, very costly peace treaty that ended up disintegrating part of the Russian Empire, so to speak. Again, so this is something that Russia was willing to pay, and they understood that this had to be paid. Otherwise, there will be ongoing resistance and uprisings and discontent in Russia that will probably get the Bolsheviks out of power. So they knew that if they were to remain in power, that they had to sue for peace and give up all this land, as you can see in this map. Again, all of that land was given to the Germans and also to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the main enemies of the Russian Empire at this time. Now, in 1917 onwards, all the way to 1919, there's going to be a civil war because not everybody was content with the Bolsheviks. There were significant number of factions, for example, arising across Russia that were not in tune with the Bolsheviks and their ideas of creating a communist state. And they're going to face rebellions across the land. Okay, rebellions by, for example, the nobility, the socialists, some members of the military are also up in arms against the Bolsheviks. There are also within Russia provinces that were added by the Russian Empire in previous decades and centuries that were suing for independence. Okay, and those were known as the nationalists, for example. They wanted to detach from Russia and create their own separate state. And what we see is a kind of civil war that plagued Russia. It was not a real clear division between, for example, communist and anti-communist. It really involved many different factions that have different agendas, if you will. But in simple terms, the people that were fighting the Bolsheviks were simply known as the whites, and again, they constituted a wide array of different groups, sometimes that have conflicting goals amongst themselves. They were known as the whites because that distinguishes them from, let's say, the reds, which were the Bolsheviks or the communists in this case. In this civil war, however, there will be, of course, foreign interventions. There will be, in this case, the capitalist powers of Europe intervening in Russia to prevent the takeover of Russia by the communists. So there was, again, an attempt to prevent a communist revolution. Particularly the British, again, the French, and also American forces will participate to some degree or another in the Russian Civil War, trying to favor, in this case, the whites, in this case, in order to contain communism, so to speak, in Russia, trying to prevent, again, this massive, massive European power from falling to the communists. And again, this is one of the missions of President Woodrow Wilson of the United States during this time, more so than being concerned with the outcome of World War I, which he was involved. His main concern was to try to prevent a communist takeover in Russia, to prevent the spread of communism also across Europe. Again, so this foreign intervention is going to intensify nationalism, Russian nationalism, due to the fact that, again, foreigners have been intervening in Russia in the past. We know when we saw, for example, industrialization, the presence of foreigners in command of the economy, and so on. That led to, of course, nationalist sentiments, and those sentiments are being magnified manifold with this intervention. Now, by 1922, the Soviets, or the Bolsheviks, are now in total control of the state. The Civil War comes to an end, and now we see Lenin forming a new country, so to speak, and then this is called the Soviet Union. Again, what it is really is a union of workers' councils. Again, that was the idea. Again, this is at least what the title suggests. And as such, they move forward to implement a new economic plan for Russia. Now, at this time, the Russian economy had been totally ravaged by first, the liberal reforms of the 19th century that affected the countryside. Then the Great War, or World War I, also destroyed many farms across Russia as well. The agricultural economy was in shambles. And the loss of lives, millions and millions of Russians perished during this process. So because of this situation, Lenin announced that at this time, the communist system will have to wait. This idea of trying to abolish private property and distribute land to everybody, for example, that idea will have to wait, creating a classless society and such, that idea will have to wait. Again, that it will be implemented, but it will be implemented over time. That at this point, they were moving on to create what is called a mixed economy, that the state will be handling aspects of the economy, particularly, for example, land reform, trying to guarantee that peasants will be in control of their own lands in order to grow grain and make money, to put, again, some money in the hands of the peasants and so on. And also, at the same time, by doing so, trying to build an agricultural base as well for Russia. In other words, look, we want to make sure that there's food production in Russia, that we're feeding our own people, that workers are fed as well, and we're going to, first and foremost, build the agricultural sector. Industrialization will come later, and maybe we can worry about communism much, much later. Right now, we're going to have a mixed economy in which there will be still some elements of capitalism, of private property, in this case, merchants, etc., and people producing products for the market, for profits. But the state is going to carry out more and more functions, more and more control over the economy. This is his initial economic plan, at least Lenin. Again, this is the way he's actually envisioning the beginning of a communist state. Now, Lenin dies in 1924, and after him will emerge a new figure. his name is Stalin, Joseph Stalin, who is going to seize control of the Soviet Union in 1928. He was a member of the Bolshevik Party. He rose through the ranks very rapidly, and he's going to seize power and institute a dictatorship that will last until his death in 1953. Now, Stalin was a firm believer in communism, however, the ideas of Karl Marx, for example. And he, in order to institute communism, he believed that it was essential to implement a totalitarian government. In other words, a top-down control of the economy and society. That every aspect of the Russian society and the Russian economy had to be in the hands of the ruler, in this case, him. This is quite consistent with the kind of absolute monarchy that had existed in Russia for many, many centuries, something that we have been discussing in previous topics. How the Tsar was the absolute ruler, kind of like a totalitarian state that he was in charge of, making decisions for every aspect of the Russian Empire. So this is consistent with that pattern. So he believes, once again, that in order to create this so-called utopian or ideal society, that it was essential, again, to take charge of everything. In other words, that the state will have to push forward that agenda by force, in a kind of top-down manner. And in order to do that, he believed that it was essential to remove all the obstacles to carry out that reform. And that meant, of course, removing personnel, people, party members that were not considered totally loyal to him in this case. So he carried out a series of assassinations. He assassinated thousands, if not really literally millions of people that were considered traitors, for example, or not sufficiently loyal to him. In this case, people like Trotsky, for example, who organized the Red Guards that were key for the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Fearing that Trotsky will one day topple him, because he was very popular as well among the Bolsheviks, he ordered Trotsky's assassination. Again, that is just one example of the kind of purges that he carried out, the so-called Great Purges, particularly those that were carried out between 1934 and 1938. Again, there were hundreds of thousands of people being arrested, about 300,000 were executed, and millions of them were imprisoned. Again, they were sent to the gulags, as they were called. Those were actually like concentration camps, in Russia. So again, this is a massive, massive totalitarian move by Stalin in order to try to institute communism in Russia. So the plan was also to industrialize, and this is something that Russia had been attempting to do in the past, to try to move Russia towards an industrial economy. It was essential if Russia was to create an effective communist state. And so therefore, Stalin is going to try to industrialize Russia also very rapidly. In this case, industrialize by being in control of industry. This is state-run industry. We're talking about heavy industry, mainly steel, manufacturing, for instance, mining, railroad construction, and the like. They're trying to transform, in this case, the Soviet Union into an industrial power. Okay, the Soviet Union. All right, so now, as Stalin is moving forward with this plan to industrialize very rapidly, he's also attempting to transform the agricultural sector. It had been recovered, but remember, there were some elements of capitalism embedded in agriculture still in the Soviet Union at this time. And so he wants to remove those elements of capitalism, this private ownership, in other words, of land, and he wants to collectivize the land in agriculture. The collectivization in agriculture means that now the land will be owned in common. Again, this is the way that back during the period of the Russian Empire, the land was actually owned in common by the peasantry, the mir, the village land holdings, for example. So he's kind of going back to that old feudal idea in which the peasants were in charge of the land, and they owned the land in common and they worked the land together. And this is the idea that he has in mind. Again, is really a communist idea, but at the same time, it is a pattern that Russia in the past carried out. It was changed by the attempt to modernize the Russian economy in the 19th century when they started privatizing those land holdings. But now Stalin is returning to that idea. That the Russian, or in this case, the Soviet peasants will have to feed the nation. That they will have to work together, own the land in common, and as well, and produce the food for the entire nation. Okay, so we see this process, being pushed forward by Stalin. Now, at the same time that he's trying to industrialize and collectivize agriculture in the Soviet Union, Stalin is also building the socialist/communist state by providing, for example, certain social programs. So again, the state is in total control of the economy, and society is really in control, for example, of the economy in terms of providing employment. Everybody is working for the state in the Soviet Union. This idea of the private sector, that you're working for a private firm or company, again, during this time, that era is coming to an end, as now in the Soviet Union, people are now working for the state. Again, so they're in charge of employment, also education. The state is in charge of all education as well, housing, for example, social programs, and the like. Again, this is the kind of quote-unquote ideal that Stalin is trying to push forward, but at the same time that he's trying to do so, he is resorting to totalitarian measures as well in order to implement that, which really, again, affected millions and millions of people in the process, as many of them were, as I said, executed, arrested, or imprisoned, etc., across the Soviet Union. All right, now part 4 is going to look at the Chinese Revolution, and here we're going to look also at background, the events that led to the Chinese Revolution, just like we did with Mexico and Russia. Here, we're going to look at, for example, modernization. This is going to be the background that will explain why China is also going to react against the process of modernization. So let's start with that. Again, modernization in China. Modernization in China, if you recall, began around the 1640s, again, with the coming of a new dynasty, the Qing dynasty in this case, that ruled China between 1644 and 1912. Again, it is during this time that we see, for example, the presence of foreigners, in this case, Europeans, that are coming into trade. If you recall, mainly the British are coming into trade, and that led, of course, to the interference of the British in China proper, with the Opium War, something we covered in the past. We're not going to repeat that. But one of the consequences of the Opium Wars between Great Britain and China was that as China lost those wars, China was quote unquote forced to open up their economy to the European industrial powers, signing a series of treaty ports, something we talked about also in previous sessions. Again, in the 1860s, we see China awarding the Europeans a series of ports and granting them what is called extraterritoriality and dual sovereignty. What that meant is that as the Europeans came into China and were in control of ports in order to import industrial goods from Europe to be sold in China, the Europeans were also granted the right to create their own separate governments in the territories that they control, in the ports that they control. So there was a kind of like a dual sovereignty in which there was Chinese authority, but at the same time, in the European control regions, there was also a European authority as well. So this is not outright colonization by any means, but there is a very strong European influence being felt in China. There's also European spheres of influence, in that beyond just controlling certain ports, the Europeans, particularly, for example, Russia and France, are now in China proper, exerting significant influence in controlling territories. This is not, once again, colonization, but there is this quasi-colonization taking place in which foreign powers are coming in and pretty much seizing control of certain markets across regions of China. Okay, so this is the situation that China is finding itself in the 1860s, as they're attempting to modernize by opening the doors to the Europeans, believing that, well, the Europeans are going to bring their know-how, their technologies, their cultural ideas, and this is going to help China catch up with the West. But the Europeans were not only doing that, they were also bringing their own missionaries to try to convert the Chinese population to Christianity as a project or process of transforming China into a westernized society. Something that was called back during that time a type of cultural imperialism as well. So this is, again, the situation that the Chinese encounter as they're encountering the West, is that the West is taking over the economy and also the culture. Now, as a result of the presence of the Europeans, we see also the rise of a Chinese business class. They were known as the compradores, the middlemen. In other words, people in China that will trade with the Europeans, they will buy low products produced by the peasants or the artisans in China, and they will export it to Europe and make, of course, money in the process. They will also buy products from the Europeans, and they will turn around and try to sell it also in China as well. And so they're going to ascend as a class, and they're going to acquire significant economic power. Although they were deprived of political power, they're going to be a power in their own right. Again, keep that in mind, because this is going to be key for understanding the Chinese Revolution, that we see a new social group on the rise. Now, in the 19th century, China is also trying to industrialize. They're trying to catch up with the changes taking place in the West, in places like the US or France, Germany, Great Britain, for example. And they're allowing some European merchants, investors, industrialists to come in and open up factories. And we see the massive spread of factories across China. Some of them are owned also by Chinese nationals as well. So this is trying to modernize the Chinese economy by trying to mechanize it and trying to industrialize it, inviting, in this case, foreign capital, and something similar to what happened in Mexico and also to what happened in Russia. Now, in terms of the agricultural sector, China is also trying to modernize it as well. We see population boom in China And that led to the need to make agriculture more efficient, trying to privatize agriculture. That meant, once again, seizing lands from the peasantry and putting it on the market for landowners, for well-to-do individuals, sometimes even foreigners, to buy those lands in order to create commercial farms, to grow cash crops, in other words, for the market. So again, this is also affecting a great number of peasants across the land in China. Now, last but not least, there is also an attempt within the Chinese imperial state to modernize China by means of promoting education systems that will prepare the future generations for an industrial high-tech future. This was called the self-strengthening movement. Okay, the self-strengthening movement was a movement to start really revamping the educational system of China in terms of, on one hand, trying to promote Western science and technology, for example, mathematics, physics, chemistry, and the like, again, those hard sciences, if you will, among the Chinese population, but at the same time, to never lose sight of Chinese cultural traditions. That yes, we want modernization, but in terms of the material benefits that modernization can bring, but we want to retain our own cultural identity in the process. Again, this was the attempt to modernize in a very highly traditional setting. Now, obviously, there will be reactions to modernization. Okay, there will be, of course, elements within China that are not going to respond well to the changes because they were the most affected. For example, peasants. There's, again, a massive numbers of peasants within China that are losing ground. They're losing lands. In this case, they're being thrown off the land and they're landless. They're being forced to move to the cities in search for work. Some of them stayed in the countryside, now laboring landlords for meager wages, growing cash crops. So we see the immiseration of the Chinese peasantry. So this is going to lead to massive discontent and uprisings, peasant rebellions in China. Again, this was compounded by not only the privatization of lands, but also the bureaucratic corruption. The bureaucracy itself in China was involved in selling peasant lands, sometimes to members of the bureaucracy itself, that they were themselves seizing lands, in other words, from the peasantry. So this led to a massive rebellion called the Taiping Rebellion from 1851 to 1864. It was actually a millenarian/messianic rebellion led by an individual by the name of Hong Xiquan, who claimed he was the brother of Jesus Christ. Again, so there's a blend of Chinese culture and philosophy with Christianity already because of the presence of European missionaries in China. Again, so the Chinese adopt elements of Christianity, but they appropriate those elements and now create their own philosophy. In this case, what Hong Xiquan was saying was that he had received visions, prophecies in this case, that there was a new kingdom, a new era coming. In other words, a new era that was imminent, that it was about to take place. He called it the heavenly kingdom of great peace, in which there will be an egalitarian society, in which there will be no class distinctions, there will be no hierarchies, no leaders, no imperial state, no foreigners, and that the land will be owned in common, and there will be peace for 1,000 years. So again, this is very consistent with Christian biblical prophecy, but in this case, this peasant uprising is interpreting this biblical prophecy as a time of redemption for the peasantry, that there will be this egalitarian society, that there will be no exploitation, that there will be no poverty and the like, and that this is imminent. This is about to happen. Again, that provided a source of inspiration for millions of peasants to revolt, and that led to a massive, massive, massive rebellion that will span for many years, and that will result in massive deaths, considering again that by the time we're talking about the mid-19th century, when we talk about 20 million people being killed by this uprising, this was again an astronomical number of people. Why this is going to be important? Because this served as a backdrop, so to speak, for the communist revolution that China is going to carry out in the 20th century. Again, that we see signs of uprisings and peasants trying to reclaim their lands and trying to build a new society in which the peasants are going to be in control, again, of society. We see also nationalist rebellions. In this case, there are groups within China that feel very much left out from this process of modernization, particularly the mandarins, again, some imperial administrators, for example. And they're going to be very much worried that China was being overtaken by foreign powers. Again, they are sensing that Chinese civilization and Chinese culture is being undermined by the presence of foreign ideas, foreign merchants, and we're talking about European in this case, and the presence of also missionaries as well, bringing in Christianity to the land. And we are going to see that the mandarins and other imperial administrators and members of the imperial military are going to stage massive nationalist rebellions. Two of them. One will occur in 1898 to 1899. It was called the Boxers' Rebellion. This was staged by members of the Imperial Army. Many of them were generals that were involved in martial arts academies, and they led a massive uprising against foreign merchants and foreign missionaries. Again, so they attacked, once again, Christian missionaries and European merchants and trying to drive them out of the land. This is a picture or painting, better said, that depicts, of course, the Boxers' Rebellion. It's a Kung Fu master telling the European monarchs to stop partitioning China and dividing China amongst themselves. Again, trying to remove them, in other words, from the land. So again, this is a clear sign that there are also nationalistic sentiments on the rise within China. Again, the rise of nationalism, again, defense of land, the defense of Chinese sovereignty, and the like. Those are not necessarily peasants. Those are, again, administrators, mandarins, members of the military. Now, in 1911, we see another rebellion. This was known as the Changsha Rebellion. It was really staged in the city of Changsha, again, in South China. That was a rebellion that was staged against foreigners on one hand, but also the Chinese business class that was seen by Chinese society to be in cahoots with the foreigners as well, trying to exploit Chinese peasants, Chinese artisans, trying to take advantage, in other words, of Chinese society and being more and more connected with the outside. So we see also a massive uprising in 1911 that is going to also destabilize the imperial system. And it is precisely in 1911, as a result of this rebellion, which was also massive, that is going to bring the conditions for the revolution itself. A revolution that began with the crumbling of the imperial regime itself. This is the beginning stages for the Chinese Revolution, so to speak. We see an imperial regime in decline. That is quite obvious, and it is obvious to everybody due to the fact that public opinion across China is very clear on this, and that is that the emperor is very weak. Is very weak because on one hand we have the Europeans pretty much taking over the economy. Okay, we got British, we got Russian, we got French, for example, some German. Even the Japanese, again, are seizing control of certain ports, aspects of the Chinese economy, and the emperor seems to be only like a figurehead in this. Again, so that's problematic. We also see the rise of warlords. With the Taiping Rebellion that we saw, this messianic millenarian rebellion in the mid-19th century, because the emperor was unable to put down the rebellion, what actually happened is that there was a series of landlords that control certain provinces that believed that it was their responsibility to form their own armies in order to put down that rebellion. So that rebellion was quelled not by the imperial army, but by regional, armies. And that led to the rise of warlords. Now what we see is that across China, there are landlords that have their own private armies and are now controlling their own provinces and their own regions. And so the centralized imperial state is considered to be quite weak, because now what we see is a growing power in the provinces once again. So this is going to be instrumental for the development of the Chinese Revolution. And now the merchants themselves, the Chinese business class, they demand political power. They want reform because they cannot participate in the state. They want to transform now China into a new country in which the business class will have more say in the system. And that led to the birth of the Chinese nation itself in 1911. All of those forces combined, the instability in the countryside, peasant uprisings, rebellions, the rise of warlords, the presence of the Europeans taking over the economy, and the rise of the business elite in China all put all the pressure to create a political revolution in 1911. The warlords, the landlords that control their own private armies, along with some members of the military, are now forcing the emperor to abdicate, to leave the throne, so to speak, and pretty much put an end to this imperial dynasty that have been ruling China for literally thousands of years. Again, this idea of China being governed by monarchs or emperors, again, really comes to an end in 1911. Again, so here, the idea is that, well, we're going to see the construction of a new state in a new nation as well. But what that nation and what that state is going to be, well, that is to be resolved, because not everybody agrees with what China should be or what the government should be. In other words, we're not going to be a monarchy. We're not going to be an empire. But what is China going to be like then? So this led to the rise of political parties. Again, so this is quite obvious. In the birth of new nations, we see the birth of political parties that present different visions for the future of that new nation. On one hand, we see a political party that was called as the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, as it was called, China's Nationalist Party. The Chinese Nationalist Party was a party that wanted modernization. We want to modernize. We want to transform China into a modern industrial power. We want all the benefits of that, of a modern industrial society, but with the less presence of foreigners in the land. This didn't mean that they were going to cut ties with the foreigners, but they didn't want the foreigners to be present in China. They were open to foreign investment, however, foreign capital and so on, but they did not want foreigners to be in control of territories. In other words, bringing in their ideas, their religions and such, into China. Those were the nationalists. So they want modernization, industry, and the like. On the other hand, we see, of course, the growing group in Shanghai, the Communist Party, who is really not the kind of European type of communism. This is a Chinese version of communism that was very much centered in the life of the peasant ideal, the peasantry. We talked about the Taiping Rebellion, how peasants wanted to bring in a new kingdom of peace in which there would be an egalitarian society. Well, the Communist Party of the 20th century is really the heir of the Taiping Rebellion. Again, those are the kind of ideals that the Chinese communists want. They want a peasant culture, a peasant society. They want the restoration, again, of an agrarian society in China in which the peasants are going to be in control of the culture and the economy at large. And initially, there was an uneasy alliance between the nationalists and the communists. They will fight from time to time, but this was not really a civil war per se. They were just kind of tolerating each other. At some point, of course, the nationalists are going to take charge of the state. As soon as the emperor abdicated in 1912, we see now the state in China being led by Sun Yat-sen, who is going to govern China from 1912 to 1926. He was a nationalist, so he's a modernizer. He wants to create the kind of changes that were taking place in the West. He wants to integrate modern science, technology, a modern economy, industry, railroads, and all of that. But once again, without the cultural influences of Europe and the West at large. Again, this is the kind of model that he wants to follow. Now, at some point, Sun Yat-sen, who had been educated in the West, by the way, he dies in 1926, and he's going to be succeeded by another nationalist. He's really a member of the Chinese military, Chiang Kai-shek, who is also a modernizer as well. And as he takes charge, he's going to place China on this fast track to modernization. He really wants to modernize as quickly as possible and create the kind of changes that had occurred in the West. The modernization, for example, of the West that took place, ever since, let us just say, the 1700s, what took the West centuries to accomplish, Chiang Kai-shek wants China to accomplish that in a couple of decades. So he's really trying to accelerate modernity, in China. And to do that, again, he's really trying to industrialize, trying to build industrial plants and factories, inviting foreign investment, once again, without the presence of foreigners in the land. And so he's open to foreign investment. This is very important to note. The only power that Chiang Kai-shek wants out of China is Japan. He's trying to invite European capital into China, but not Japanese whatsoever. Okay. Now, he's also trying to double down in transportation development, trying to build modern roads, railroad development as well. It doubles during this period of time. And he's ending the extraterritorial rights and dual sovereignty. He's canceling the treaty ports. In other words, he's really driving the European South, telling them that it is not necessary that you're here. We're going to work with you. We're going to protect your interests. But again, we don't want your presence here, again, in the land. Now, in terms of land reform, the peasants are still waiting for the distribution of land. Chiang Kai-shek, the fact is that he was very much tied to the business elites, the business class and the landlords. So he's not going to go against them. He's not going to seize lands from them to give it to the peasants. And so that, this is an incomplete modernization. The peasants are still being left out of the equation. And because there's significant pressure from below, Chiang Kai-shek believes that it was essential to eliminate the competition once and for all. And that means eliminating the communists. So in 1927, he implements a purge. He's trying to purge China from all communists, and he goes against them. He's ending this uneasy alliance with them. And this is going to force, in many cases, the communists to reorganize, to come together and try to fight Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. At this time, we see the emergence of a leader, Mao Zedong, who is really the leader of the communists. In this case, he emerges as this natural leader, so to speak. At first, he's being driven south into China from the nationalist, onslaught, and he is now resolved to build a large army to combat the nationalist forces. And he looks around, and the most obvious sector of the population that will come to his file and ranks will be the peasantry. He understands that the Chinese peasantry is still very much landless, disaffected, exploited. They run into the millions of them. I mean, the vast majority of the Chinese populations are peasants. So from a very practical point of view, he goes to the peasantry and he builds an army, a revolutionary force, in other words, promising them, of course, land reform, land distribution, and of course the formation of a new state, so to speak, in which the peasants were going to be in control. Now, at some point, they were forced also to march. They're being pretty much attacked and persecuted, and they are forced to march to Yan'an. It's a northern province in which they take refuge. This was called a long march. It took a few years for them to complete. They started out with 90,000 of them. Again, it was a revolutionary force of 90,000 strong, and a great many of them died along the way. Only 7,000 of them survived. And again, the survivors of that long march will end up being the leaders of the communist revolution that is about to take place. And a great many of the officials and top bureaucrats of the communist regime that gets instituted after 1949 were actually survivors of this long march. This is very important. Now, in 1931, we see another development, and that is the Japanese invasion. The Japanese have imperial ambitions of their own, and they start seizing parts of China. For example, in 1931, they seize the northern province of Manchuria to extract mineral resources, particularly iron ore and coal. And again, this was full-blown imperialism from the part of Japan against China. By 1937, we see now the occupation of China by the Japanese imperial forces. So again, they're going against the nationalists, the Japanese. Once again, they're battling the nationalists. They oust Chiang Kai-shek from power. They're also going against the communists because the communists are seen also as a threat to the Japanese. And what we see is a three-front war in which the nationalists, the communists, and the Japanese are fighting each other. Sometimes the nationalists and the communists form an uneasy alliance to fight the Japanese, but that alliance doesn't last very long. And obviously everybody is really fighting each other. So this is really a mess during the 1930s in China. Again, China is now being ravaged by a number of different factions, all fighting for the control of that country. Now, the nationalists, however, lose support from their coastal elites. The business elites are centered along the coastline, and the coastline is controlled by Japan. So the nationalists are really losing a lot of their monetary financial support from the business elites. This is very, very important as a result of the Japanese invasion, as you can see in this map. Now, the communists, as this is taking place, the communists are now moving forward, implementing land reform. They believe that in order to build a larger revolutionary force, that it was essential to start distributing land to the peasants. They're attacking landlords, they're imprisoning them, they're seizing their lands, and those lands are being given to the peasants. So this was a very practical, strategic move by Mao, in this case, in order to build a popular base of support that will be far and wide across China, that will join the ranks again of the revolution, trying to start distributing land, in other words, by force, and then eliminating the landlords that have been in power for thousands of years in China, blaming them for every ill, and also the business elites, the business class, that they are, exploiters and parasites and the like. So he goes against them as well. He builds this very large army and starts attacking the Japanese as well. Again, so the Japanese are facing also fire from the communists, not only the nationalists, and now the communists are building, of course, a larger and larger military force. And by 1945, the Japanese lose World War II, they surrender, and they're ousted from China. And as a result of China being now freed from Japanese control, there's now going to be a civil war. Again, there's a vacuum of power in China, and now the nationalists and the communists are fighting each other for the control of that state. Here, the Soviet Union intervenes on behalf of the communists. They're funneling weapons through Manchuria, and the nationalists are defeated in Manchuria in 1948. Chiang Kai-shek is forced to flee south, and obviously by 1949, the nationalists are totally expelled out of China, and they're forced to move into Taiwan. Now, by 1950, the communists are now in power, and they build a new country called the People's Republic of China, and quite rapidly they're instituting a series of reforms, communist reforms, collectivization of land. In other words, they're destroying the land-owning class and distributing all the land to the peasants. Again, this is their main objective. Again, this is a peasant revolution. More than anything else, in China, communism is really a peasant, led revolution. Also, they're interested in building, of course, industry, an industrial economy, heavy industry, and Mao is, just like in the Soviet Union, in charge of building, steel plants and railroads. That will be led by the state totally. They're suppressing also the drug trade that led to the opium addiction, again, in the past, and trying to suppress it altogether. And they're also trying to purify Chinese society from all Western elements, alcoholism, prostitution, fashion dress, all the dress styles, all the elements of Western culture are being totally eliminated out of China. So this is really going back to the roots, if you will. The communists are really trying to take, China back to the past, in this case, to classical ways of dress and the way of life, particularly the peasant ideal. Now, he's also trying to create a new society and a new man again. So this is also moving China forward, so to speak, and trying to create a collectivist and an egalitarian society in which, this idea of individualism, people working to benefit their own selves. Again, Mao is trying to remove that altogether, that they are indeed a collective. Again, this is consistent with the ideas of kinship, that they are indeed an extended family, in other words, and that people will see themselves, or they will have to see themselves as a collective, and there will be no class distinctions and no hierarchies as well. Now, in order to accomplish that, he implements something called the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 62, and it is really trying to develop the economy without hierarchies and bureaucracy. Trying to develop industry, for example, and also the agricultural sector without any leaders whatsoever, imagine, or elites that will be in charge of this process. So in order to accomplish that, he's actually promoting, for example, building backyard furnaces in the countryside, for example, that the peasants themselves are going to be in charge of. Building communes in the countryside as well. Those are actually, again, collectives, if you will, in which peasants own the land in common and they sustain their own societies. And also sending workers and intellectuals from the city to the countryside so they can work the land. So if you have been living in the city for too long, if you are, in education, a university professor, you'll have to be sent to the countryside to grow food for the country so you can experience, in other words, the culture, so you can be in touch, again, with the plight, with the suffering of the peasantry in this case. Now, in the 1960s, we're going to see something called the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 68, in which it was believed that the Great Leap Forward, this idea of trying to develop China's economy without building hierarchies and leaders, was a failure, that it did not really work, in other words. And so the reaction is going to be that, well, yeah, it didn't work, but it didn't work because we're still very much kind of possessed by Western influences. We need to purge China from all Western influences. So we see a persecution of Westernizers. In other words, anybody that's trying to promote Western ideas, European ideas, or American ideas are going to be purged from society. So what we see is student organizations in China forming so-called Red Guards and trying to point out, for example, administrators or professors or members of, for example, the administration, the government administration, for example, or working within the economy that have attained the status of elites, that they are promoting Western ideas and that they see themselves as elite members of society. So they are indeed considered to be the enemies of Chinese culture. They need to be purged, in other words. And the way to do that was to put them into prison and also force them to live in the countryside for life, to be peasants, in other words. Again, so that included, again, people that were, once again, working for the state, working in education, working in the economy, are now being driven into the countryside so they can, again, engage in forced peasant labor. Again, this was considered to be a cultural revolution trying to purge China from all Western influences. Okay, so what we have seen so far, the summary points here, is that we have seen 3 traditional societies attempting to modernize. In the process of modernization, we see the dismantling of peasant societies. The peasantry, again, are going to be the great losers, again, in this process of modernization, from the extraction, the expropriation of their lands. And also, as they were trying to industrialize, we see the suffering of an industrial working class as well. The modernization also took place by the increasing influx of foreign capital that ceded territories or markets to foreigners, and that led to nationalist sentiments within those traditional societies. That produced a series of revolutions across the 20th century, particularly, as I mentioned, Mexico, Russia, and China. And those, for the most part, were revolutions led by peasants. Those were peasant revolutions, aided also by the proletariat, in this case by the industrial working class. Those were the typical revolutions of the 20th century. Those are peasant revolutions along with the working class. Again, they're really reacting and rejecting the process of modernization. The Mexican Revolution led to outcomes such as nationalism and socialism. Again, Mexico is now clearly driving out the foreigners from the land and creating a state in which people are going to be included somewhat at some level in the state. Peasants, workers, the middle class, administrators, landowners. Again, we see that a kind of socialist system implemented after the Mexican Revolution. Then the Russian Revolution was the first anti-capitalist revolution that also had nationalistic goals as well. It was a revolution that moved from socialism initially to communism. We saw that with Lenin through Stalin, for example. And now, at least, again, the idea is that the workers are in charge of this process, the workers' councils or the Soviets in this case. And Stalin, in order to institute this workers' councils regime or utopia, assumes total control of the state against a totalitarian, pretty much, state. In the Chinese Revolution, we see nationalism as well, directed against foreigners, and mainly a revolution led by peasants. This is a peasant revolution, peasant communism, that ultimately took control of China and instituted a communist regime that really tried to create a peasant ideal, so to speak, in which, again, China will continue to be an agrarian society led by peasants, and that the land will be owned in common. We see the destruction of the land-owning elite, the business elites as well, and the purging of all Western elements as well. Again, trying to restore traditional elements of Chinese civilization, in the 20th century in the face of this. What we see, after all, is that particularly when we look at the Soviet Union itself, is the dangers of the modern state in using the powers of the state to implement a certain agenda, a certain ideal or utopia. That was detrimental to great sectors, great portions of society. Again, this is the caveat, so to speak, of the Bolshevik revolution in the Soviet Union, is the dangers of the modern state in trying to create an egalitarian society by means of totalitarian solutions that resulted in purges, executions, imprisonment, for example, of dissidents and unloyal individuals, etc., that were considered to be enemies of the revolution. That is, again, the unfortunate situation that we saw, for example, in the Soviet Union. All right, so this is all I have for you. We're going to start a new topic coming next. I will announce what the topic is going to be when we come back. This is all I have for you. Thank you.